think Ecclesiastes is one of those books, I think, which holds a certain fascination for all of us. Just even perhaps as you read together chapter 1 this evening, you will have perceived that it's a very philosophical book. And that makes it an intriguing book, because you wonder what is the philosophy of the preacher as he starts to begin these chapters and opine on what in fact is the meaning of life. Of course, Ecclesiastes finds its place amongst the poetry section of your Bibles. That is the section between Job and the Song of Solomon. It's like Proverbs, inasmuch as what you'll find out throughout these pages are pithy little statements and little pearls of wisdom that drop out as you carry on reading. But unlike Proverbs, it's not that diverse. This is one big argument across 12 chapters. I'm going to suggest to you, in fact, that it's Solomon's thesis. This is Solomon's doctorate on matters of religion, and particularly on, as you can see here, the meaning of life. What Solomon does here is to conduct a great royal experiment. And the experiment is to see whether there is any lasting satisfaction in life outside of religion. And I'll explain that to you a little more as we go on, but that's basically the goal that he sets out and fulfills as he runs through the course of the book of Ecclesiastes. As far as I'm concerned personally, this is in fact the book that really struck me as, when I first came to the truth. I didn't grow up in the truth. My parents weren't in the truth. I'd never met a Christadelphian until I went to a public lecture when I was 20 years old. And the interesting thing was that I was 20 and I went to this public lecture, and it was at Christmas time. It was back in 1986, and there was a papal visit of Australia and New Zealand. And I was in Christchurch, grew up in Christchurch. I was at university when I was 20 years old. And I go to this public lecture, and it's in December to coincide with the papal visit, which had perhaps just occurred. And I got talking to this brother outside the lecture theatre in Christchurch, and I said, I need to come around and see you. I've got a few questions. So he said, yeah, come around. So I went around and saw him once, and then he said, look, I can't see you next week because we're off to a Bible school over the Christmas break, so I can see you in the new year. And I said, okay, that's fine. Obviously, I've got a lot of holidays, like I had a holiday job, but there were statutory holidays between Christmas and New Year. So I said, have you got any homework for me, just until we see each other again? He said, yeah, okay, here's the thing. Why don't you read Genesis 12 to 22? Now, you'll appreciate his intention was to start talking about the promises to Abraham. So I thought, no problem, that's not a very big job. And if I'm going to start at Genesis 12, I might as well start at Genesis 1. Now, it so happened that my mum had given me a New International Version of the Bible at about that time, because I had Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on the door, I had Mormons knocking at the door, and I invite these guys in and I'd quiz them and I'd play one off against the other. You know, I was trying to work out what was happening. Anyway, I started in Genesis 1 and I read all these things. I mean, I wanted to find out where Jonah was eaten by a fish. I wanted to find out where David killed Goliath. I mean, I'd seen these things on television growing up, not in the truth. Okay, and I keep reading, and I'll never forget the time I got to Ecclesiastes. I mean, I pretty much blitzed through the Psalms. I thought, this is not really that interesting. Proverbs, I've read that somewhere before. Ecclesiastes. It was Christmas time, obviously summertime. I'm lying on my parents' place. I was lying on a lilo, like an inflatable bed in the pool, getting a suntan. My glasses on, because you can't read in this bright sun. It's two shades. I'm reading like this on the pool, on the bed, on the pool, and I get to Ecclesiastes, and I just about fell off the float bed into the water and dropped the book in the drink, because Ecclesiastes 1 in the New International Version starts off like this. Verse 1, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, it says. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And I thought, what have I read? What is this saying? Now, you'll appreciate just reading that. It's a little more dramatic than it appears in the authorized version. But you can see this is quite an impactful way to start a book of the Bible. And you'll appreciate what's more, no other book of the Bible starts like that. I mean, I've been reading from Genesis up to Ecclesiastes. Yes, I skimmed through some, but nothing began like that. Well, I ran straight inside. It was about 5 p.m. in the evening. Mum's peeling potatoes over the sink like this. I said, Mum, listen to this, listen to this. And I started to read that out. And she, that's interesting, Dad. Wait, interesting? What do you mean, interesting? I couldn't believe what I was reading. And the impact of it obviously didn't hit my mum quite like it hit me. But it was clear to me, because I didn't stop at verse 1, I got to the end and I ran inside because clearly what Ecclesiastes did in these pages is it asked the most important question of life. What's the purpose of life? Why are we here? The very next thing, by the way, that I did when I read that, I told Mum, she wasn't that excited about what I had found. I went straight to the encyclopedia. There's no internet. This is 1986. I went straight to the encyclopedia set because maybe the New International Version had a comment that said it was Solomon. I knew, however, that it was Solomon somehow. When did Solomon live? And I'm, looking up Solomon, 940 BC. Like 3,000 years ago, he writes this. I thought, that's it. If he can ask that question and answer that question 3,000 years ago, then this is the book of life. Because that's the most fundamental question for all humanity, and it's still the most fundamental question today. What's the meaning of life? What are we here for? What are we supposed to do? How do you get ultimate fulfillment? And that's the question today is the very question that was asked 3,000 years ago. And it struck me then that if the Bible can answer that question, then it can answer every question. So, I've got a personal attachment to the book of Ecclesiastes. In a manner of speaking, I might say it was the book that brought me to the truth. That's not quite true. It was certainly the book that showed me the power of the Bible. Well, we say that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. Why do we say it was written by Solomon? Well, here's why. It says in chapter 1 and verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So whoever the author of Ecclesiastes is, he was a son of David. Well, that doesn't help you. I mean, it helps you somewhat, but not a lot. Critics, of course, will look at that and say, well, the word son just means descendant, so it doesn't have to be the literal biological son of David. It could be any descendant of David down through time. Solomon is only one possible answer to that question. Well, yes, but he's king in Jerusalem. Now we've narrowed the field a little further. We're talking about a kingly descendant of David, not just any descendant of David, but it could still, of course, refer to any king of Judah. Verse 12 says, I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. That is over all 12 tribes. Now you might say, now we've really narrowed it down because during the time of Rehoboam, the kingdom was split. There was almost a civil war in Rehoboam's day, and we had the kingdom of Israel created in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Critics would look at that again and say, yes, but once the kingdom in the north went into captivity, Israel was just the kingdom in the south. So maybe the word Israel could do duty just for the southern kingdom when there was no northern kingdom. Verse 16. I commune with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I'm come to great estate. I've gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yea, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. At which point, we're really only talking about one person. 1 Kings 3 verse 12, God gave Solomon a wise and understanding heart. Matthew 12 verse 42, Lord Jesus Christ recognised the great wisdom of Solomon. The Queen of the South, he said, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and lo, a greater than Solomon is here. Well, the Lord's making the point simply that he's a greater than Solomon, but behind that is the point that Solomon was great, renowned for wisdom. So I'm saying there's really no debate, I don't believe, about who the author of Ecclesiastes is. It goes on, of course, in Ecclesiastes, the preacher describes the things he did, and in chapter 2 you have a record of the great building works that that the preacher conducted, which we know Solomon conducted. Solomon built the house of Yahweh, that is the temple. He built the king's house, that's the palace. He built Millo, that's the retaining wall around the city of Jerusalem. He built the cities of Hazor, of Megiddo, of Gera, of Beth Horon, of Baalath, of Tadmor, border towns, fortress cities. He had storage cities for chariots and for horsemen. He built the house for Pharaoh's daughter. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. He had a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber. So there's an enormous amount of building work conducted by Solomon, which fits what you read from the preacher in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. In chapter 2, verse 9, it says, I was great. I was increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Now, 1 Kings 3 and verse 13 says that God tells him, there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee in all thy days. So you see, we're not really struggling too hard to identify the author of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 7 verse, well, I've got a note there, chapter 7 verse 28, 1,000 women. Now, Ecclesiastes 7 verse 28 refers to the preacher trying to find one woman among 1,000. Well, the fact is that in 1 Kings 11 verse 3, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. There were, in a manner of speaking, 1,000 women in his life. And then chapter 12 verse 9, the preacher wrote many proverbs. Or perhaps that's the most compelling point of all. He taught knowledge, it says. He wrote many proverbs. Solomon, of course, was renowned for his contribution to the wisdom literature of Israel. 1 Kings 4 verse 32, he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Well, it's Solomon. What's more, the preacher had to have some credentials. Whoever was going to write the book of Ecclesiastes and conduct this experiment, as I'm calling it, had to have some credentials. He had to have resources. He had to have wisdom. And he had to have the ability to analyse what he discovered and convey that lesson to other people. Not every king in Israel was equally gifted at interpreting events and circumstances of life and then teaching those lessons. They weren't all equally gifted at that. Solomon was. 1 Kings 10 verse 24, all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom which God had put in his heart. So there you are. There's the case for Solomon. So then when was the book written? Now I said 3,000 years ago. Well, of course, the precise dates are that Solomon ruled between 970 and 930 BC. And these words would seem to be the words of an old man, because particularly when you read Ecclesiastes chapter 12, you're reading about somebody late in life in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 when their bodily functions are starting to fail. Well, that would most appropriately be written by somebody who perhaps was in that situation, an older person. So if we were to say that Ecclesiastes was written in the last 5 years of Solomon's life, then we're going to date the book between 935 and 930 BC. Still about 3,000 years ago. Well, then the next question is this. If it's so easy to identify Solomon by the various characteristics of the preacher in this book, why doesn't he just name himself? I mean, why doesn't verse 1 say, the words of Solomon, the son of David, king in Jerusalem? Why does he have this obscurity added to Ecclesiastes 1 verse 1? Well, the reason for that, I believe, is very simple. These words were an indictment on the life of Solomon. If he'd put his name to this epistle, I think it would have discredited what was written here. People would have said, well, why doesn't the physician heal himself? Why didn't Solomon take his own advice? Because he didn't do what is recorded in these pages. You see, what I believe you're reading when you read the book of Ecclesiastes is in fact Solomon's confession. This was a great royal experiment that he conducted across the decades of his life, and he gets to the end of his life and realizes he's made a mistake, and therefore encodes the complete write-up of this experiment and tells you, essentially, do what I say, don't do what I do. And that this therefore becomes a confession of Solomon's failure, of what he ought to have done all along but never did do because perhaps he thought he knew better. And that message, you see, is far too important to be compromised by his name. Well, we call it Ecclesiastes. Why do we call it Ecclesiastes? Well, verse 1 says it's the words of the preacher, but if you look at the title, let's call it verse 0, like the title of the book, Ecclesiastes or the preacher. So whatever Ecclesiastes means, it means preacher, because it says Ecclesiastes or the preacher. Now the word preacher, as you read it through here, for example in verse 1, is the Hebrew word koheleth. And koheleth means a collector, someone who assembles things. It's based on the Hebrew word kahal, which means ecclesia, which is a collection of called out people. The Greek word for the English word preacher, which is used in the Septuagint version, is the word ecclesiaston. And of course, Ecclesiastes is just a transliteration of that. So Ecclesiastes means collector. Collector. And these are the words of the collector. Well, what's he collecting? He's collecting wise sayings. He's collecting advice. That's what he's collecting. Come with me to chapter 12. I'll show you what he's collecting. Chapter 12, verse 10. This preacher is a collector. The word preacher means collector. The word Ecclesiastes means collector. And this is what he's collecting. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 10. The preacher, or the collector, sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. So this preacher is assembling knowledge. He's collecting the fruits of experience. He's arranging them as words of wisdom, and then he's teaching them. He's looking for acceptable words, as the text says. So, the Greek word for preacher is the word ecclesiaston. Ecclesiaston means collector. Ecclesiastes is a collection of the words of the collector. That's what Ecclesiastes is. Of course, that leads us now to the purpose of Ecclesiastes. As I mentioned a moment ago, Ecclesiastes seeks to answer the vital question of life, the most burning question of life. How can we attain ultimate fulfillment? How can we attain ultimate satisfaction in this life? The quest for the greatest good, which is the basis of the book of Ecclesiastes, is just that. It was a quest. It was an experiment. It was a test that Solomon performed in life, looking for fulfillment. So what Solomon said was this: if you simply live life now as an end in itself, what would you do that would completely satisfy you and overcome all the vagaries, uncertainties, and worries of life? What would you do? What course would you pursue? Not that Solomon ignores God. I mean, in chapter 1, verse 13, he makes the point specifically, I gave my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven, this sore travail that God has given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. So he believes in God, there's no doubt. But here's the point. The only way to appreciate the value of religion is to attempt to address the questions of life without it. Isn't that true? The only way to appreciate the value of the truth is to think about what life would be like without the truth. So the whole purpose of Ecclesiastes, therefore, is to determine what man should do to obtain ultimate fulfillment. The conclusion is going to be that you can only find ultimate fulfillment in the presence of the truth, in the presence of religion. But Solomon can only get to that conclusion by examining all the issues of life without the truth, to show them how the truth answers all these problems. And here's the argument. Here's the argument of the book of Ecclesiastes. So here's the structure of the book. Basically, the book is divided into 3 major sections, because as I said, it's an experiment. Solomon's going to conduct this personally. The last half of chapter 1 and all of chapter 2, the quest pursued, or the experiment pursued by personal experience. Then chapter 3 to 6, the quest pursued by general observation. Then chapter 7 to 12, or halfway through chapter 12, the quest pursued by mature reflection. And we have an introduction, as you can see, and we have a conclusion. But that's basically the story of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I should point out that the book of Ecclesiastes is actually one of the most difficult books in the Bible to put a structure on, because it's a quest, it's an experiment. And Solomon's writing this almost like a personal diary of his life, and the experiment keeps changing direction, because he thinks, as the book opens up, that he's going to be able to answer the questions of life quite quickly, and he realises that he can't, that the answers aren't there. So he rolls on to the next phase of the experiment, but he's still got all the questions he began with, so now the experiment's got bigger. And he tries again, so he starts off by experiencing things, by doing things himself, and realises he hasn't got any lasting satisfaction. And so he looks around, chapter 3 to 6, and says, well, what's everyone else doing? And gets to the end of that after 4 chapters and realises he's now got more questions than answers. So he marshals all of that into chapter 7. And chapter 7 to 12, now he puts it all together and says, I can see what's going wrong with man. But as you'll see, personal experience takes 1.5 chapters. General observation takes 4 chapters. Mature reflection takes almost 6 chapters. The experiment's getting bigger and bigger, you see, because the answers aren't coming that quickly. Let me just show you, for example, how the problem mushrooms. Chapter 1, verse 3. He says in chapter 1, verse 3, what's the point of labour? Why is there all this work happening around us? It's not just in creation, but in our own lives. No matter what you do, you've got to go back and redo. So you plant a garden, then you've got to go and weed it. And labour never ceases. Chapter 1, verse 8, all things are full of labour. And what's more, at the end of verse 8, man is never satisfied. So you can work and work and work and work, and you still won't be satisfied with what you've accomplished. And what's more, verse 9, there's nothing new in life. And verse 11, once your life's over, no one's going to remember you. No one cares. So these are all the problems I have to overcome, says Solomon. And so in chapter 1, verse 18, I thought about it. I sat down with a long cup of coffee and I thought about everything I could see and do. And the more I thought, the more upset I got. In fact, by the time you come to chapter 2, he says, I worked like no one else in history has ever worked. I worked frantically. I built everything. Look at chapter 2, verse 5. I made gardens and orchards and planted trees and all of them, all kinds of fruits. I made pools of water wherewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I had servants and I had everything. I did everything. But when I'd finished, chapter 2, verse 22, he says, well, what hath man of all his labour and of all the vexation of his heart wherewith he has laboured under the sun? What's it done for me? I've just had a whole chapter of activity in chapter 2 and I'm not happy. I'm not satisfied. I haven't solved a single thing. My labour's still in vain. All I've done is to prove what I said in chapter 1 verse 8. All things are full of labour, me included. None of my achievements will be remembered by those that come after me. And all I've done in chapter 2 is got myself one step closer to death, and I haven't answered my fundamental questions that I began with. And then what? I'm going to die. I'm going to leave all of this to somebody else, and who knows if he might be a fool. He might blow it all. Well, now I've got another question. Where's the fairness in that? And so you see, you start off with a simple question. You don't get an answer. You generate more questions, and so you roll to the next phase of the experiment with even more questions than you began with. Oops. So where have we got to? We've expended a lot of energy. All we've done is make the quest bigger, you see. But in all that, Solomon says, there's one thing I can tell you. I can't at this point answer all the problems I began with, And I realise I'm only generating more and more questions, but I can tell you some things I've observed. For example, this one, chapter 2, verse 13. Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly as far as light excelleth darkness. So it's better to be wise than foolish. Now, I can't tell you the answers to life, but I can tell you this. Don't be stupid. Be wise, don't be foolish. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. He says, here's a pearl of wisdom for you. If your answer to the problems of life is to pretend that there are no problems in life, that would be foolishness. Don't do that. Walk with your eyes in your head. So he says, I can't tell you the answers to these burning questions, but I can tell you what to do so as not to make things worse. Even if you can't solve the problems in life, you can at least keep your eyes in your head. But when you come to the structure, this is how it basically looks. And I've described it as personal experience, general observation, mature reflection. I'll show you why we've done it like that. Come back to the start of chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a chapter of activity. Verse 1, I said in my heart, go to now, I will. Verse 3, I sought in my heart. Verse 4, I made me. Verse 5, I made me. Verse 6, I made me. Verse 7, I got me. Verse 8, I gathered me. Okay, personal experience, wouldn't you say? This is what Solomon did. Well, he doesn't get satisfaction by what he does, so he comes into chapter 3, to the second great phase of the experiment. And it says in chapter 3, verse 10, I have seen. Chapter 3, verse 16, moreover, I saw. Chapter 3, verse 22, wherefore I perceive. Well, this is not personal experience anymore, this is observation. The whole cast of the experiment has changed, you see, between chapter 1 and 2 and then chapter 3, 4, 5, 6. And you'll read the same in chapter 4. I returned, verse 1, and considered all the oppressions done under the sun. It's something I considered. Chapter 4, verse 4, again, I considered. Chapter 4, verse 7, then I returned and I saw. So what you've got in chapter 4 is snapshots of one event after the other as Solomon looks around him and to try and find out whether anybody else has answered the questions he's trying to answer. So chapter 1 and 2, personal experience. Chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, general observation. When you come to chapter 5, you've got a major change. Chapter 5, verse 1, keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God. Be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, and so forth. Now this is interesting. The first 4 chapters, Solomon says, I did this, I did that. I saw this, I saw that. Chapter 5, you should do this, and you should do that. Now what's happening here? Well, this is the basis of the structure. You can see we've got the quest pursued by personal experience, by general observation, and by mature reflection. But interspersed amongst those sections, you'll find exhortations to the ecclesia. Direct exhortation, chapter 5, verse 1 to 7, on worship. Chapter 7, 1 to 22, a direct exhortation on better things. Chapter 9, verses 7 to 10, a direct exhortation on death. 10 verses 1 to 4, a direct exhortation on wisdom. 10 verse 20 to 12 verse 7, a direct exhortation on the day of opportunity. And these direct exhortation sections are all characterized by one thing. They use the words thee and thy, thee and thou. Solomon speaks in the second person. You know what the second person is? You know, the first person is I. The second person is you or thou. The third person is they. All the way through Ecclesiastes, he's speaking in the third person. I did this, I did that. I saw this, I saw that. I think this, I think that. And then he injects these direct exhortations throughout the book, as I've got them there on the screen. And by the way, you should do this. You should do that. Don't do this, but do that. Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, you see. And so if you go through Ecclesiastes and look for the words thee and thy and thou, they will be in the exhortation sections. They only occur in the exhortation sections, with one exception in chapter 9, where he talks about, well, the thee and thous only occur in the exhortation section. There's a phrase, however, the phrase under the sun, which never occurs in the exhortation section, except in chapter 9 where he's talking about death. I'll explain that to you. In addition to this structure and our exhortation sections, there are various key words that the book of Ecclesiastes has. The first, obviously, is the words thee and thou. Wherever it occurs, he's speaking to the ecclesia. Whenever Solomon uses the language thee and thou, he's speaking to the ecclesia, and that's these exhortation sections. The next key word that you find in Ecclesiastes, or key phrase, is the phrase under the sun. The phrase under the sun occurs 29 times. There's an equivalent phrase, under heaven. It occurs 3 times. So 32 times the phrase under the sun, or its equivalent, occurs in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, why does he keep saying this and that and the next thing happened under the sun? Well, it basically means in the presence of the sun. Like, it just means on the face of the earth. But it relates to things that happen in this natural life now, in the natural world without God. It's talking about things that happen to all mankind. You and I obey the traffic lights under the sun. So does everybody else out there. It's all happening under the sun. One of the natural things of life. And if you colour in the phrases under the sun, you'll find that they never occur in the exhortation sections, because the exhortation sections are written to the ecclesia, except in one case in chapter 9 where it talks about death, which applies to everybody under the sun, in the ecclesia or not. But there is a phrase that occurs in the exhortation sections in relation to the sun. It occurs in chapter 7 verse 11 and in chapter 11 verse 7, both of which are exhortation sections. And it's the phrase, see the sun, or behold the sun. And of course that makes the whole point. All the world is living under the sun, merrily going on about their daily lives, without any cognizance of God's purpose, except the ecclesia. The ecclesia can see the sun. They understand the purpose of God. And therefore the exhortation sections on 2 occasions talk about seeing the sun or beholding the sun. Everywhere else it's under the sun, talking about common man. The third key word or phrase, or word actually, is the word vanity. You read it in chapter 1 verse 1, or actually chapter 1 verse 2, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Well, the word occurs 5 times in that verse, chapter 1 verse 2. It occurs 40 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And vanity means something transient, something unfulfilled, the state of the world without God, something meaningless, something pointless. That's what the word vanity means. And so you see, throughout Ecclesiastes, Solomon's really addressing 2 issues. Life without God compared to life with God. That's what Ecclesiastes is about. But, one of the other things is, because it's a sort of a philosophical book, you'll see that there are enigmas. I'll show you one. See if you can figure this out. Come across to chapter 8. There are enigmas in Ecclesiastes. That is, apparent contradictions. And you can't work out what he's getting at. Look at this. It's chapter 8, verses 12 and 13. Now, how would you unravel the contradiction between chapter 8, verses 12 and 13? Though a sinner, verse 12, though a sinner do evil 100 times and his days be prolonged. Okay, so it's talking here about a sinner who's extremely wicked and lives a long life. Verse 13, but it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days. Okay, but he doesn't live a long life. Well, does he live a long life or doesn't he? Chapter 8, verses 12 and 13 appears to contradict, like verses back to back. The churches say, oh, well, clearly what's happened here is that Solomon wrote verse 12 and some scribe has inserted verse 13 and verse 13 is not inspired. Whoa, hey. If we take scissors to the Bible like that, we can answer every question, of course. Just cut out what you don't like. Do you have a better answer? Or what if I was to say to you, the answer must be this. Verse 12 must be talking about man in his natural life. And the worst of all sinners can indeed live to a very old age. But verse 13 is talking about man in an eternal sense. And when the saints inherit immortality, then the long life of the sinner is really just a shadow compared with that. But you can see, for example, how people become confused with the book of Ecclesiastes. I'll show you another one. Have a look at this. 1 verse 18. What would you make of this? Here's another conundrum. This is not a contradiction so much, but it's a conundrum. Chapter 1, verse 18. In much wisdom is much grief, so the more you learn, the unhappier you get. Well, if you're at school, you can probably relate to that. In much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. All right, that's pretty clear. Well, what do you make of this? Chapter 2, verse 26. For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight wisdom and knowledge and joy. Well, evidently in chapter 2, verse 26, wisdom and knowledge are a blessing. Are a blessing from God because you're good in God's sight. Except that chapter 1 verse 18 says, well, the more wisdom you get, the more grief you get, the more knowledge you get, the more sorrow you get. Well, what kind of a blessing is that? How would you reconcile chapter 1 verse 18 with chapter 2 verse 26? It almost reads as though God's cynical. He says, they've been very good before me. I'll show them. I'll make them wise. That'll hurt them. Well, what would you make of that? Chapter 1 verse 18 versus chapter 2 verse 26. The answer again, you see, is it really depends on the point of view you take. Chapter 1 looks at life in isolation to the exclusion of God. And if you remove God from the equation, the more you learn, the more frustrated you become, the more difficult the problems of the world will appear to you because you know more about how severe they are, how intractable they are, and how corrupt man is. But if your wisdom is the wisdom from above, if it's the wisdom from God, chapter 2, well then Psalm 119 verse 130 says this, the entrance of thy word giveth light. All of a sudden everything becomes clear and the wisdom of God becomes an enormous blessing, you see. So the wisdom of God, chapter 2 verse 26, is very different to the accumulated wisdom of the world. In chapter 1 verse 18, it really depends on your perspective, you see. So the apparent contradiction or the apparent conundrum is really not there at all. But you can see how people could become confused with Ecclesiastes. You want to see how fundamental Ecclesiastes is? Look at that. The issues of Genesis 1 to 3, the seed plot of the Bible, are resolved in the book of Ecclesiastes. In Genesis 1 verse 31, God pronounced at the end of day 6 that his creation was very good. That's what it says in Genesis 1 and verse 31. In Ecclesiastes 7 verse 29 it says that God made man upright. So man at the start of creation was upright. He had not sinned. All creation was very good, says God. Genesis 2 verse 24, for this cause shall a man leave mother and father and cleave unto his wife. Ecclesiastes says in chapter 9, verse 9, live joyfully with the wife of thy youth. In Genesis 3, verse 6, mankind sinned. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 20, there is not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. The woman was in the transgression first, it says in Genesis 3, verse 12. Ecclesiastes 7, 26, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets. Genesis 3 verse 17, as a consequence of the sin in Eden, the earth was cursed. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 15, that which is crooked cannot be made straight. Man's nature is irreparable, this side of immortality. sorrow and sighing and death in the world are irreparable this side of the kingdom age. The punishment comes upon the man in Genesis 3 verse 19. He's consigned to labour. Thorns and thistles would be his lot. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 8, all things are full of labour. I can see it now, says Solomon. What's more, man's going to be consigned to death. Genesis 3 verse 19 as a consequence of the sin. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 19, that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. We all go to one place. There's no difference between any of us, man or animals, despite the difference in intellect. And then after the fall, when you come to Genesis 4, Eve begat Cain. He calls him Cain because Cain means gotten, and Eve thought that Cain had been gotten from Yahweh, and that perhaps he was the promised seed of Genesis chapter 3. Well, it became quickly evident that that was not the case when we got to know Cain. He goes and kills his brother. So she eventually kills his brother, but before Abel was killed, he was named Abel. Abel means vanity. The word vanity in the book of Ecclesiastes is the Hebrew word Hebel, or Abel. In fact, if there's any builders here, you might have built a house and clad it with Hebel cladding. Hebel means vanity because it's concrete blown with air, and air is a vapour. It's vanity. So they call it Hebel, Hebrew word. And finally, in Genesis 6 verse 5, when we are about to flood the earth in the days of Noah, it says in Genesis 6 verse 5 that the imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 3, the heart of the sons of men is full of evil. Madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they die. What do you think of that as a commentary on human life? Madness is in your heart while you live, and then you die. Whew. Well, he gets to that by chapter 9. All right, so what's Solomon's final conclusion? He asks all these questions. What does he get to at the end of the quest? He says 3 things. This is what I figured out by the end of chapter 12. The book of Ecclesiastes is all about exposing the conflict between the desire for fulfillment and a life in which nothing is ever fulfilled. You can never say in life that that's done. You can never guarantee that it's finally done. Serving God is the only key to complete satisfaction and fulfillment. The fact is, you're built with minds that can appreciate spiritual things. As a consequence of that, you've got an ability to see into the future. Now, I don't mean you can tell the future. I mean that you can imagine into the future. The reason God has built you like that, young people, is so you can appreciate eternal principles like love and faith. Cows and dogs can't do that. They can see about as far as the next blade of grass or the next bone. They don't dream about the future. You can take your capacity and you can fill it up by dreaming about your next holiday, or dreaming about your next Bible school, or dreaming about your next retail purchase. And if you keep doing that enough, as most people in the world do, you can fill up your desire for fulfillment by keeping changing the question. But you'll die ultimately unfulfilled. God's given you a desire for the eternal so that he can teach you the eternal. And therefore that's the only way to be ultimately fulfilled in life, by applying yourself to eternal principles. There is real advantage, however, he says, in living this life as a day of opportunity leading to a larger and more complete purpose. Don't expect justice in this life. Don't expect ultimate fulfillment in this life. I mean, in this 70 as considered by itself. Don't expect to tie up all the loose ends. Don't expect to answer all the questions. It won't happen. Because as far as God's concerned, there's a much bigger purpose. And this life, this mortal life, is only one part of it. And there are things that might happen to you and me in this life which you say, there is no reason that this should have happened to me. I didn't deserve this to happen. That might be true. And if you just look at your 70 years as an event by itself, it might be unfair. What if you looked at the 1,070 years of your prospective life? And then reflect on the fact, which perhaps you will do one day, that, wow, that happened to me and it seemed so tough at the time, but it was because of this that was going to happen in eternity. Then you'd look back and say, well, now I can reconcile it. But if you try and reconcile it within the 70 years, you will not find the answers. This is one of the key things you see he finds in Ecclesiastes. Come back to chapter 1. I'm just going to now take you through chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, and then we stop. This is the introduction, because the first 11 verses, of course, were the introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes in our structure. Here's the quest of Solomon. Ecclesiastes 1, verses 1 to 11. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, we've already considered the preacher. Preacher means collector. The only thing to add here is that he identifies himself as the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And you might ask me, well, listen, you made the point, Uncle Neville, that Solomon concealed his identity already. He doesn't name himself as Solomon in order not to do violence to the integrity of the message, because he wasn't a great example of living this message. Well, why does he reveal this much? I mean, he hasn't made it very hard to identify him, has he? Even if he didn't name himself. Well, I'll show you why. He's got to at least include some of his credentials. And here's why. If you turn the page to chapter 2, verse 12, there's a vital thing you've got to appreciate about Ecclesiastes. I turned myself to behold wisdom, the preacher says, and madness and folly. For what can the man do that cometh after the king? Only that which hath already been done. He says, look, the fact that I'm the king gives me opportunities which you won't have. It gives me access to resources that you won't have. It gives me money that you just won't have. What's the point? If you ever choose to embark on a quest like this, understand that you won't exceed me. I was the king. I ran the country. You'll never have a better quest than me. Learn from me. Don't repeat my folly. I was the king. You see? He doesn't want to sully the message with his name, but at the same time he's got to say, but by the way, don't think I'm just nobody and I had, I didn't have $10 in my back pocket. I had millions of dollars to pump into this experiment. Do you have that? No, you don't. Well, don't think you're going to be able to conduct it as well as me. And trust me, it cost me more than $1 million. Verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Well, there's our key word. 40 times, as I say, it occurs. It means emptiness or pointlessness. The NIV translates it meaningless. This is something transitory or devoid of substance which provides no lasting satisfaction. That's the meaning of the word vanity. Psalm 144, verse 4. Man is like to vanity. His days are a shadow that passeth away. James 4:14. What is your life? It's even a vapour that appeareth for a little time and vanisheth away. So you see the entire fabric of natural life is insubstantial. It's unsatisfying if lived as an end in itself without the truth. Without the truth, everything is meaningless, just a chasing after the wind. That's what Solomon says here. Verse 3. What profit hath a man of all his labour which he taketh under the sun? Under the sun. There's our next key phrase. It occurs 29 times. You'll see it here in verse 3. You'll see it in verse 9 of this chapter. And its companion phrase, under heaven. You'll see that in verse 13 of this chapter, which occurs 3 times. Under the sun is a phrase which does duty for everything that happens in the natural world. In a literal sense, everything that man does happens under the sun. So this phrase implies everything we do in our whole life in the natural world, whether we're in the truth or not, in the natural world. But this is interesting, this phrase, under the sun, because it doesn't just appear in the Bible, it appears in, let's call it profane literature. This style of language, under the sun, under heaven, upon earth, and so forth, is known in other ancient works. Babylonians' writings speak of 2 realms. Occasionally in Egyptian writings, a similar antithesis is found. Rickman's refers to a similar formula in South Arabian inscriptions. The expression under the sun occurs also in an Elamite inscription. Then in the late 4th century Phoenician inscription of Tabnith, king of Sidon, the phrase has exactly the same form as in Ecclesiastes. Similar terminology is found in the late 4th century BC inscription of Esmanazar, king of Sidon, and so forth. What's the point? All cultures have philosophers which talk about things that happen under the sun. Every culture is grappling with the same question as Ecclesiastes grapples with. Come across to 12 verse 12. Look what it says here. This phrase occurs everywhere. This phrase occurs in all the wisdom literature of mankind, not just in the wisdom literature of the Bible. Look what it says in Ecclesiastes 12 verse 12. Further, by these, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. What's the point of verse 12? What are these many books on? Well, I'd suggest that these many books are books on the very issue of Ecclesiastes. It's not talking about, I don't know, Enid Blyton writing 500 books or Agatha Christie writing 300 books. What? The many books he's talking about here are books on the issues of life, self-help books on how to get enjoyment out of life. He says you can debate it for years. The world's got no shortage of books that are trying to answer the fundamental questions of life. He says, forget it. I've given you the answer right here in 12 chapters. Every culture has to wrestle with this because, of course, mankind has always asked the same question. What are we here for? What's the meaning of life? How do we get ultimate fulfillment in life? And verse 3 of chapter 1 said, what profit hath a man of all his labour? What's profit? Well, profit is what you have left over after you subtract your cost from your revenue. That's what profit is. It's whatever's left. So if you think of life like a business transaction, you work all your life, you get to the end, what have you got left over after you've paid all your debts? We're reminded of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12 in verse 17. What shall I do? I've got no room to bestow my goods. I'll build bigger barns. I'll eat, I'll drink, I'll be merry. Thou fool. This night is thy life required. Mark 8 verse 36. What profit hath a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? And Solomon says, well, what have I got left over after my labour? Where is this leading me? So this is why the Apostle Paul in Colossians 3 verse 2 says, set your affection on things above and not on things on the earth. See beyond this present life. Understand this present life for what it is. It's just a day of opportunity. Lay up treasure in heaven, don't lay up treasure on earth. Don't fall prey to this life. Or in the words of Ecclesiastes 11 verse 7, truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun, to see the sun, to understand what this life's all about and what it's for. And now he amplifies the problem. Look at verse 4. One generation passes away, another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. So here's the brevity of life, contrasted with the permanence of the earth. And man's life is so short, he's got no hope of changing anything in creation. He's bound into this weary cycle of death, so everything's the same as it's always been, verse 4 implies. Every generation is just another generation. One generation dies, no problem, another rises up to replace it. And the earth just keeps going, doing what it's always done, spinning every 24 hours. It just keeps going. And then verse 5, the sun rises, the sun goes down, and hasteth to the place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about to the north, and it whirleth about continually. The wind returneth again, according to his circuits. And then the water cycle. All rivers run into the sea, but the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. So you've got the sun, the cycle of day and night in verse 5. You've got the cycle of the wind in verse 6. You've got the cycle of water in verse 7, everything is going around and around and around and expending enormous amounts of energy and getting nowhere, because the wind that started off here blew around the whole world and got back to here. The water rained on the river, ran down to the sea, evaporated, and rained on the river. What have we done? And this is what Solomon's saying. He says, and my life is no different. It's happening to me, and everywhere I look, it's happening the same. Enormous amounts of labour. I mean, look how depressing Solomon's perspective is. Just cast your eye back to verse 5. Let's just talk about the sun. Now, the sun occurs a number of times in Scripture in different capacities. In Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah describes the sun as a symbol of dependability. He says, thus saith Yahweh, Jeremiah 1:35. Thus saith Yahweh, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon, and the stars for a light by night. If those ordinances depart from me, saith Yahweh, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. So Jeremiah looks at the sun and he says, I look at the sun and I see dependability. It's going to rise every day. Without hesitation, the sun will rise every day. I can bank on it. It's a symbol of consistency, a symbol of certainty. And so for Jeremiah, the sun sits there like a rock in the sky, unfailing, unchanging, reliable, and he compares that to the promises of God. David looks at the sun like this, a symbol of strength. The sun, well, in Psalm 19, the sun's like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. So David looks at the sun and he watches the first lights come from above the horizon, bursts itself, like catapults itself across the sky, and then plunges into the darkness on the other side. And then the next day, rivets up the sky like this and does it all again, like a man sprinting from the starting blocks. He says, wow, that's what the sun is to me. Solomon says, phew. Well, I'll tell you what it is to me. The sun ariseth, the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. And the word hasteth in verse 5 means to gasp or to pant. So Solomon says, all I see is exhaustion when I look at the sun. Day after day, this thing claws itself up to midday and then gasps for breath until it reaches the western horizon, only to get up the next day and do it all again. It's a symbol of futility, a symbol of monotony, a symbol of hopelessness. But that's life without the truth, you see. That's how Solomon sees it. And that's how he describes it. And to make matters worse, in spite of all the activity in creation, despite the fact that creation is labouring to the point of exhaustion, verse 8 says, all things are full of labour. Man can't utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Not only is creation exhausting just to observe it, but I'm a slave to my own eyes and ears. I'm a slave to the environment, that's obvious. I'm a slave to my own body. I'm never going to wake up and say, oh, I'm not going to open my eyes today. I've seen enough now already for life. I've seen enough. I've seen everything. I'm not going to open my eye. That'll never happen. The eye won't let you do it. It always wants to see a new thing, or the ear hear a new thing. And what's more, he says in verse 9, the thing that hath been is that which shall be. That which is done is that which shall be done. There's no new thing under the sun. Life's never changed since creation, he said. If we omit God from the picture, history's a closed circuit. Each generation only gains the same experiences as the former generation. So history is destined to repeat itself. Verse 10, is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? Or, no, he said, no, there's nothing new. It's been done already of old time, which was before us. Now, you might read that and you might say, not true. I mean, think about iPhones. They're new. Solomon never saw iPhones. There are things, and you could name 100 of them, there are things that are visibly new. Inventions. Solomon's point here is, however, in relation to personal satisfaction, there's no new sources of happiness. What might appear so is only an illusion. It's superficially new. Think about fashion. There's no such thing as a new fashion. Even though new outfits appear every day, there's no new fashion. verse 11. And what's more, there is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. No generation ever profits from the experiences of a previous generation. Advice can be passed on, experience cannot. You can't put old heads on young shoulders. At some level, you've got to learn it for yourself. I can tell you, don't touch it. It's hot. You'll burn yourself. You say, how hot? What do you mean hot? Oh, I burn myself. You know, I've had 5 children who've all burned themselves. Candle flames are a classic example. You don't believe. How bad can it be? Oh, yes, it's as bad as you say. Oh, man. That's what life's like. Now, on small things like candle flame, you can afford to learn that. On big things, you can't afford to learn too many lessons. But you know the problem here? And here's another of the conundrums of Ecclesiastes. He says in chapter 1, verse 11, that one generation does not learn from the previous generation. That's what he says in chapter 1, verse 11. But look at chapter 2, verse 12. Well, what do you make of this? If he says that in chapter 1, verse 11, that one generation doesn't learn from another, what do you make of chapter 2, verse 12? I turn myself to behold wisdom and madness and folly, for what can the man do that cometh after the king? The whole point of him saying that in chapter 2, verse 12 is, don't try and beat me. You'll fail. Learn from my experiences. But clearly he's just said in chapter 1, verse 11, but I know you won't. Because one generation never learns from the former generation. Why does Solomon conduct this quest, young people? Why does he bother? Why does he do this experiment? Oh, so that he can find out the greatest answer of the greatest question for all time. So that subsequent generations can learn from his experience. That is clearly why he's written this down. Yet, by his own admission, that kind of experience can't be passed on. Nobody can surpass the ability of the king to do an experiment or to pursue pleasure in life, but they think they can. Nobody can be as wise as this king to evaluate all these issues, but they think they can. Nobody could ever have the advice for future generations that Solomon does, but they think they will. You want to know something? God never told Solomon to do this. God never asked Solomon to conduct this experiment. Never asked him to pursue the quest. Why not? Why wouldn't God ask Solomon to do it? Don't you think that the conclusions that Solomon gets to and the way he reasons are so valuable that God ought to have asked him to do this? Why didn't God ask him to do this? Oh, come to chapter 12, verse 13. What does Solomon conclude? He concludes in chapter 12, verse 13, the conclusion of the whole matter: fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole man, or this is the fulfilled man, or the completed man. There's fulfillment in life. Well, wouldn't you say that conclusion is worth putting in a Bible? Wouldn't you say that God ought to have asked him to have conducted this experiment if that was the conclusion that was going to wind up at the end? God never did. Why not? Deuteronomy chapter 6. These are the commandments, the statutes, the judgments which Yahweh your God commandeth to teach you, that thou mightest fear Yahweh thy God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee and thy son and thy son's son all the days of thy life. Why didn't God ask Solomon to conduct this experiment if the conclusion Solomon gets to is so important? And the answer is because the Bible already contained that answer. Moses had written it 500 years before. 500 years before. Why didn't Solomon read Moses? Because he had to learn for himself, didn't he? Because he had to learn it for himself. Because he thought he could figure out something that Moses didn't know. He thought he had more money, more opportunities, more resources, more wisdom, and he got the same answer as Moses. That's human nature. And that's why Ecclesiastes is written for us. Moses had the answer, young people. Solomon confirmed it. Don't repeat the experiment a third time. Not just, by the way, because Solomon's already written the answer better than you could or I could, but if for no other reason that you don't have time. Britain's left the EU. Russia's now in Syria. The US is pulling out of the Middle East. Christ is coming. If you think you can run off to the world, experiment, conclude that it was a bad experiment, and come back to the truth, it may be that the alarm goes off before you get back. Don't repeat the experiment a third time.